Jasper Scherer, politics editor at the Texas Tribune, and Brad Johnson, senior reporter at the Texan. Thank you so much, and welcome back to Eye on Politics.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks for
You
having us.
bet. So, with the special session soon underway, Governor Abbott expanded his agenda for lawmakers to consider. And as he said he would, he included flood projects that would respond to the disaster and the horrific deaths that we saw in Central Texas. But also, they include raw politics. So, just before we take a deeper dive into those topics, what did you make of the expanse of this call? Brad, we'll start with you.
It's pretty bold. I'm not sure how they're going to get all this done in the span of 30 days. This is quite a slate even for a regular session. Obviously, a lot of this stuff didn't pass during the regular session. So they had 140 days to do that. Now they have 30. I'm hard pressed to believe they get everything done. A lot of it is red meat, taxpayer funded lobbying, the Women's Privacy Act, known as the bathroom bill, property tax relief still, and reform. I think the governor sees an opportunity to try and get this stuff across the line, or at least advance it further than it got during the regular session. And we've got some top lines. We got the THC fight we knew was going to happen. We've got congressional redistricting, and then we've got flood mitigation.
And Jasper.
Yeah, I thought it was a major curveball to, include such an expansive list of items. And, I think it threw everyone for a loop, especially given the initial list of topics that the governor announced, that, there's kind of the marquee item over the THC fight. Then everything else that he initially talked about were, kind of lesser known cleanup bills. And then all of a sudden he comes out swinging with some of the biggest, unfinished conservative priorities from the session, on top of all that. So I think, I suspect part of the calculation was, we're doing kind of an inflammatory move to redistrict, to redraw the congressional lines. In the middle of the decade, Democrats are already going to be peeved about that. So might as well throw in a bunch of other stuff that will also make them mad, kind of for good measure. Just why not? But as Brad said, I would also be surprised if the success rate is at 100% when all is said and done. But yeah, lots of kind of long time conservative wish list items that the governor's throwing on here, and it's going to be fascinating to see if they can get any of it done.
Yeah, I mean, we could be seeing multiple special sessions out of this, depending on how far the governor wants to push. And what I'm wondering before we take the deep dive on these topics is, why do you think? I mean, I know there's certainly been Republicans who've been calling on the governor to add, more to the special session call, certainly on property tax relief and some of these other issues. But is the governor doing this because the Democrats are going to be there, and because flooding is going to be such an important part of this session and where there's bipartisan support?
I would say that the inclusion of some of these, absolutely with redistricting, I think that's part of the calculation that, the Democrats can't afford to look like they're skipping out on this, much needed, money to help these hard hit communities recover from the devastation, et cetera, and absolutely, I think including those other items on top of that, I think it's all part of the same bucket. If Democrats are going to have to be there to approve this flood relief, then why not force them to go for all these other items that didn't get done during the regular session?
Brad?
Yeah, going into this, the question was, we heard the rumors about redistricting. It's been a thing for a while. The Trump administration has been pushing for it. The question was, how do you keep Democrats in town? And before the horrific flooding happened, what's the bait to give Democrats? There's a lot of talk. My kind of theory was give them a chunk of the border reimbursement money coming from Congress, and we might still see that, I think. But now we have this flooding issue that is an emergency and has to get done ASAP. And politically speaking, Democrats can't afford to skip town for this. And there's that, but they also just out of their own volition don't want to miss that because they want to have a hand in this. They realize the need too. We saw a bunch of statements from them coming out as well about, and along with Republicans, about the need to address this going forward. So this is the thing that the governor at least is counting on is going to keep them in town.
And as far as, let's take a deeper dive on, this horrific flooding that we've seen in Central Texas. Obviously, so many questions. And with the topics, the agenda items that the governor's mentioned, flood warning systems, flood emergency communications, relief funding for Hill Country, and then natural disaster preparation and recovery. I would imagine there are going to be, hearings obviously associated with the specific bills, but there are going to be a lot of questions that have to be answered from the first responders, from the Division of Emergency Management, which set up shop 2 days before these storms came in. They may hear from family members. They may hear from experts on just the needs for this area. So, I mean, that's going to suck up a lot of energy, no?
Yeah, I agree. And it's we saw either the speaker or the lieutenant governor say that they'll probably form investigatory committees as soon as the end of this week. By the time this goes out, they will have been formed, I assume. We may even have had hearings done, but those will certainly take up a lot of time during the beginning of this special session. They're going to have to hash out what exactly it is they feel is not just doable, but sufficient to respond to this crisis here. And how much money are they going to allot to this? We've got a bunch of money sitting in the pot in the rainy day fund and in the treasury surplus as well. We've also got money presumably coming from Congress for the border reimbursement. There's a lot of opportunity here to make people as possibly whole as you can after this kind of horrendous disaster. And we'll see what the legislature ultimately decides on it.
Jasper?
Yeah, I think it also kind of lays the groundwork or at least creates some potential for really, uncomfortable situations where, you've got this, critical flood relief, flood recovery money, and just, any other items that the legislature feels is necessary to respond to the storm, paired with all these highly contentious partisan issues on the same agenda. And you start to think about how the timing and the pacing of the session could play out in the order that all these pieces of legislation will get passed. Are you gonna, if you're the Republicans in charge, are you gonna pass the flood relief first, check that box off, and then kind of give the Democrats free rein to skip town once they've taken care of that? Or do you maybe mix in the flood relief with some of those more contentious items to make sure your other priorities get done, but then you're kind of opening yourself up to the criticism that you're, playing politics with flood relief. So it's a lot of kind of complicated political considerations, I think, in terms of, how you sensitively approach this much needed relief with the dueling consideration of how to get as much of your priorities, your partisan priorities done.
Well, I mean, on that note, this week or, leading up to the special session previously, there had been this certainly strong sense of bipartisanship because of just the sheer tragedy down in Central Texas. And now with all these other items on there, does that really just go away, or do Democrats have to, in a way, compartmentalize to the point earlier, Brad?
I think we'll see some of both. We already saw House Democratic Caucus Chairman Gene Wu come out pretty strongly and condemn the slate that we have here, and he accused the governor of basically playing politics with this flood money, flood mitigation response. So, I think we'll see some. When we get to that point, we're not going to see Democrats or even objectionable Republicans causing problems on that. But the question is, like Jasper said, what happens after you pass that, or what happens in the meantime while you're, putting the flood issue off in order to keep people in town, that's going to cause a lot of headaches for leadership in both chambers to have to navigate. And the thing about being governor is you can call them into session, but you're not the one that really has to do all the legwork of legislating. That's up to the two chambers and the two guys that lead those chambers. It's a really easy spot to sit in, just declaring this as a special session, but he's going to have to roll up his sleeves and do what he can as well, to try and assuage concerns on various issues as we work our way through this.
And Jasper, on that point, to what Brad said, I mean, certainly it's an easier job for the lieutenant governor, and how the Senate operates, but I would imagine a much more difficult job for Speaker Dustin Burrows, given that the House works far differently.
Yeah, I will say I do not envy the task at hand for Speaker Burrows over the next month or 6 weeks. Just thinking about all the coalitions he has to manage. Considering the fact that a lot of his initial support that elevated him to his position came from Democrats who, if you see some sort of revolt from them, there's always the potential that of some tomfoolery from Burrows's critics on the right. And so, I on the other hand, he has shown kind of I would say a fairly impressive ability to navigate those complications just during the regular session. Remaining on Dan Patrick's good side is not something that a lot of Texas House speakers can claim they've pulled off through the course of a full session. So, I'm sure they're already, Speaker Burrows and his kind of leadership clique, they're already thinking about how to approach this stuff and chewing over some of the questions we've already raised here.
I did want to ask one other question on the flooding disaster before we move on. And that is, there is a push for answers about, what did the locals do after receiving, the warnings from the National Weather Service? Did they do enough to warn people? Did people actually receive this? And, so they've faced a lot of tough questions from national media who've come into the state to deal with that. And then on the other hand, we heard the governor at one of his news conferences use a football analogy when answering a reporter's question about who's to blame. And the governor said, only losers ask who's to blame and winners talk about solutions. I'm wondering, what did you make of that when you heard that? Brad?
I don't think that analogy, I think it fell flat, and I don't think it persuaded anybody. I understood the point he was trying to make, and I don't think he conveyed it well at all. A football team is nothing like this, and I think he rubbed a lot of people the wrong way in making that comparison. On the media side, yeah, it's been, I think, pretty objectionable the way a lot of it seems to be mainly national media has handled themselves coming down here, like bulls in the china shop, demanding answers on things from people who are still trying to find missing persons. They're still pulling dead bodies from the rubble. You got to have a little bit of grace for these local officials who are trying to put pieces back together of their community, mind you. Like these reporters are coming in from out of state. They rarely ever cover Texas politics, only when something big like this happens. Meanwhile, this is a community that's trying to that not only has a bunch of people dead within it, but a bunch of people missing and families that are missing their loved ones. So I think it's been pretty abhorrent the way national media has handled things, shouting at these officials during press conferences. And that doesn't mean that these press conferences have gone smoothly in every way. They have not. There's been some very poor performances from state officials on that, but all around, it's been pretty bad, I think.
And Jasper?
Yeah, I think that, I like Brad, I understand where the governor is coming from on that, but I think it's also worth keeping in mind that his inclination to seek solutions. A lot of the way that happens is by figuring out what happened, what went wrong in the first place, figuring out how to, avoid repeating that mistake next time, figuring out what this community, needs to make sure nothing like this ever happens again. So, I think it's natural to, want to kind of expect, some reasonable amount of grace in the immediate aftermath, and to not, pile on with, gotcha accusations and shoddy reporting right off the bat. But at the same time, it's completely fair game to seek accountability when something like this happens. And if anything, we should all be encouraging that so we can figure out the best policy solutions going forward.
Yeah, I mean, in my years in the business of doing this, there's a way to ask a tough question without being objectionable about it. And so, yeah, I hear what both of you were saying there. So let's go take a little deeper dive into the redrawing of congressional districts, because it's certainly very interesting. And in the governor's agenda, he said specifically, he cited constitutional issues as it relates to 4 of the congressional districts, districts 9, 18, and 29, which are in the Houston area, I believe. And then the 33rd congressional district, which is up here in the Dallas-Fort Worth area that's a seat held by Democrat Mark Vesey. And so, Brad, talk to me a little bit about your thoughts on this letter and the use of, quote, coalition districts, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, so the letter itself is interesting because it's clearly a coordinated justification on the back end to do redistricting. You don't need any reason to do redistricting. The legislature can redistrict at any point. They just have to do it at the first session after the census. So they could do it if they wanted. This is them trying to find cover to do it. And so they're citing a Galveston court case that was decided, I think, last year, where the court ruled that you didn't need that a majority minority coalition district didn't count as a minority district. And so basically the Voting Rights Act is trying to protect minorities' voting power. And so they found that a district that had 31% Hispanics and 20% Blacks those two demographics did not align enough to constitute themselves one minority in order to reach that threshold. So it's complicated legalese, but basically all these districts that are a combination of different minority demographic groups, if that constitutes a majority, then under this justification, they're able to be redrawn, at least under this case law. So it's really going to shake up the map a lot. And it will go farther than just those few districts, because you will have to pull Republican votes from other places. And I think the entire map's going to get shaken up. This is not going to be limited to just those 5 congressional districts.
And Jasper.
Yeah, I mean, I think one sort of takeaway from what Brad was talking about there is, the part of the end game seems to be hoping, essentially, I don't know if this is like going to be an explicit effort to challenge, key provisions of the Voting Rights Act, but certainly, you could see a result where these maps, however they, get redrawn, are challenged in court, and under the, sort of the reshaped federal judiciary system, where you've got a bunch of new judges, installed by the Trump administration in recent years. I think it's fair to at least speculate that Republicans have that in the back of their mind, that, we could essentially see a big gutting of the Voting Rights Act that would, in the future, give them a lot more free rein to draw these districts, in ways where they don't have to be bound by keeping these minority communities, tightly packed together so that, they don't have to think as much about concerns in diluting their votes. So it, kind of the one takeaway could be just far-reaching implications, not just beyond Texas, but for other states, future redistricting cycles. If, and I know we're several steps away from what I'm talking about here, but, I think that is absolutely in play, that, Republicans see an end game of making some changes through the courts to the Federal Voting Rights Act.
And it's interesting because, this really came up in a New York Times report that this started at the White House with President Trump wanting Governor Abbott to add this to a special session call to expand the number of Republican districts. And what I think is interesting is, a quote here from Congressman Mark VC, again from Fort Worth, who said, quote, "This is an order straight from Mar-a-Lago and carried out at the expense of Texans. Let's be clear, this is not about fairness or constitutionality. This is about the coward-in-chief, Trump, and his lapdog, Greg Abbott, trying to rig the system because they know they can't win a fair fight in 2026. So clearly he's very angry because this puts his seat in the political crosshairs. And we already have a court case in El Paso that's talking about the 2021 maps. And then to your point, Brad, before that, once you start fiddling with these districts, I mean, they were already changed in 2021 to kind of make it safer for Republicans to hold on to their seats, and at the same time make it safer for even the Democrats to hold on to their seats. So yeah, if you start tinkering here and tinkering there, like you said, everybody starts getting messed with. And I don't know, and you're talking with members of Congress, the Republicans, I haven't met one who's really all for this. Have you?
No, because they like their solid red districts the way they are. And this is a directive from the White House. President Trump does want this, and Texas isn't the only state that has been told to do this. From the reporting and from what I've heard, they think they can get 5 additional Republican seats. I don't see how that happens. There's the 2 fairly purplish districts in South Texas, CD 28 and CD 34, that I think are very gettable for Republicans. But other than that, you're putting sitting Republican members in danger of losing either next cycle or the one after that, if wins go against them. And is the juice worth the squeeze on this? I think that's what a lot of Republican congressmen are asking.
Jasper?
Yeah, and I think the 2010, the post 2010 census round of redistricting is probably fresh on at least some of these Republicans' minds. I mean, you just think of Pete Sessions, also up from the North Texas area, kind of a test case of what can happen when you kind of overstretch, and by the end of the 2010 census cycle in 2018, demographic shifts kind of aligned with just a really favorable environment for Democrats that led to Sessions, also John Culberson down in the Houston area, losing his seat because those districts all looked a lot different than they did in 2010 in terms of the makeup of who was voting there. So Pete Sessions now back in Congress in a different district, involved in all these talks. I'm sure he's offering friendly reminders about what happened to him and what could happen to potentially any other Republican if there's any sort of miscalculation in how these new districts are drawn.
And let's chat a little bit more about the THC ban, because now we have specific language that the governor added to the agenda here. And one of the items is protecting children from THC. So essentially making it a crime for providing hemp-derived products to people under the age of 21. And then he says regulating hemp-derived products for adults. Legislation comprehensively regulating hemp-derived products including limiting potency, restricting synthetically modified compounds, establishing enforcement mechanisms, all without banning a lawful agricultural commodity. So it's quite a mouthful, but my limited understanding in this issue, it's very hard to tell how much potency these items have. I mean, you have to do very expensive and extensive testing. But what do you make of these two items, the way the governor has addressed them? Jasper, we'll start with you on this.
Yeah, I mean, I think he's being fairly prescriptive, still kind of staying within the bounds of, how much the governor is allowed to dictate, it seems like. But, he's also being fairly clear that he wants to see a kind of a regulatory framework like, similar to what he's called for in the past when he made that last minute decision to veto the full-on THC ban that was passed during the regular session. So I think he's, kind of making clear where he stands on this. I think if there was any daylight where he was willing to go for a full ban, he would have indicated that to Dan Patrick, who's lieutenant governor, who still seems equally dug in right now on pushing for the ban that he passed during the regular session. So, but a lot of this stuff is what was talked about by the House during the regular session when they wanted to pursue the regulatory option. Establishing age limits for purchasing these products, putting restrictions on packaging, requiring them to not be marketed in ways that are attractive to minors. So I think we'll probably see a lot more of that, just based on what the governor is laying out in his call and just the kind of conversation swirling around. But the $1 million question is, what the Senate and Dan Patrick are going to be okay with.
And Brad, to Jasper's point there, I mean, because this was the lieutenant governor's one of his key issues throughout the regular legislative session. It was the lowest bill after the budget and after school choice, SB 3. And the lieutenant governor really pushed this. And so what seemed to be indicated is that he may just, try to refile SB 3. What are you going to be looking for in all this? Because it certainly created quite the stir after the governor, vetoed this bill.
I think we're going to see a game of chicken between the lieutenant governor and the governor on this. And traditionally, the lieutenant governor has won these things. You look back at the 2023 property tax fight, and Patrick won that. He got essentially everything he wanted. Also, keep in mind, during that fight, he read off some precedent into the journal record, arguing that while the governor can set specific topics on the call, it's the legislature that decides what is actually passed under those topics. And so we'll have a huge power struggle here between those two. And big question is, where does the speaker fall on this? If we're to take Lieutenant Governor and Senator Charles Perry's words, Speaker Burrows is, at least mostly in their camp on this issue. We'll see if, when push comes to shove, that holds, or if the lower chamber takes him a different way. We've already seen House members put out statements glad that the governor vetoed SB 3 and wanting to take another more tailored crack at it. A lot of moving parts here, and really, who knows where this ends up. And you kind of be a fool to bet against the lieutenant governor, but he is really running uphill against this issue. We saw the massive political backlash in the public after the bill passed and before the governor vetoed it. So a lot left to go here, but man, this is going to be a brawl.
Yeah, it's interesting because this really kind of just mushroomed after the regular session ended. A huge pressure campaign by the hemp industry and a lot of pushback, some of it by conservatives against the ban, against the lieutenant governor. All but 2 Republicans in the House and Senate voted for the ban. And so I think it's going to be very interesting to see how this plays out, especially amid the polls, which show that conservatives and Republicans are pretty divided about this.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a fascinating way of kind of highlighting the extreme amount of power that Dan Patrick wields within the Capitol. Just that dichotomy you highlighted there, Jack, about the difference between the Republican kind of just everyday voters' opinion on this issue and the near unanimous support for the ban from elected folks in the Capitol. I think it's I struggle to think of an example of an issue where there's been a disparity like that, and that really just I mean, clearly can be traced back to one man. It shows kind of the grip that he has over his own chamber, but also really that influence bled over to the lower chamber, to the House as well, considerably this past session, and yeah, we have not seen any evidence that he's letting up on his push for a ban.
And Brad, did you have any final comments you wanted to say on this before I move on to some of the other agenda items?
I'll just reiterate that I think it's going to come down to Speaker Burrows. Where does he go? Where do his members pull him? Your guess is as good as mine on this, and we've seen the political hot potato that it's become. And keep in mind that they're all going to be thinking about how this will affect them in the midterm next year. I guarantee you that went into Abbott's thinking on whether to veto this or not, and that's going to be top of mind for them all.
Yeah, because they're all up. They are all up for re-election. So let's just talk very briefly about some of these other items. Cutting property taxes, eliminating the STAR test, giving the Attorney General powers, but making it a constitutional amendment that the Attorney General can initiate a election fraud case or election crime case. The bathroom bill, Brad, that you mentioned, and then banning taxpayer-funded lobbying and banning the abortion medications in the state. So as you said earlier, conservatives really support all that. Will any of this get passed?
That's a good question. I think this is Abbott's way of shoring up his right flank going into next year. And this is all from a Republican perspective, easy stuff to put on the call. Maybe not. There's some fight to be had over the taxpayer-funded lobbying bill, I think, but overall, this is stuff that the right flank of the Republican Party has been pushing for a while, and they've been really mad for some of the things that didn't pass. You can also throw in more property tax relief and reform into that. This throws them a bone, and is it sufficient? Probably not, but Abbott can at least say, hey, I tried. Blame the legislature if these things don't pass. I think this is him shoring up his right flank ahead of next year's election.
Jasper.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of these issues, if there was a universe where they could be taken up in a vacuum, and it's just, both chambers of the legislature are controlled by Republicans. Obviously, Governor Abbott putting them on the call signals his support for them. By themselves, there's not a whole lot of controversy behind these items, just in terms of, very few Republicans are going to go out on a limb and oppose them. The challenge is, for Republicans who want to pass all this stuff, is none of this is happening in a vacuum. There's, as we've talked about, all the, the flood relief that's on the table. This unresolved THC impasse is kind of hanging over everything else still at the moment. So, it's I think going to be an issue of the order of operations in some ways. How do the legislative leaders engineer a situation where they can take up these bills, at a point where they stand a good chance of passing? Do you wait till you get the flood relief out of the way, or do you try to knock them all out first? But I think it's the fact that there's so much else going on top of this kind of grab bag of unfinished priorities, just colors everything in sort of unforeseen, complicated ways.
Well, we will leave it there. Jasper Scherer, politics editor at the Texas Tribune, and Brad Johnson, senior reporter at the Texan. Thank you all both very much. We really do appreciate it.
Thanks, Jack.
Thanks, Jack.